Hello everyone. In the screencast today, I'm going to be looking at the case study methodology, and you're going to see that it's a very exciting and varied method. It's ideal for the EPQ, and for those of you who are going on to university, it's something that is used in a great number of disciplines in my own education, in psychology, in social sciences, in geography, etc. The case study is a very important method that is used within research. So what are we covering today? I'm just going to do a very brief recap of the difference between qualitative and quantitative research methods and what's the thinking behind those differences. I'm going to look at what a case study is. I'm going to look at types of case study. I'll be covering the advantages and disadvantages of a case study. I'll be looking at this issue of generalization in the case study. Can we take the specific case study and generalize outwards or not? And then I'm going to be touching upon issues of reliability and validity. And finally, I'll be looking at planning a case study. And at the end of the video podcast, I will give you some really good case studies to look at, especially in the business world, that will give you ideas if you're going to be using this methodology in your report for the EPQ or in your dissertation later if you're at university. First of all, I have to acknowledge my sources. I've relied very, very heavily on this particular book, which I strongly recommend. It's called Research Methods in Education, and it's edited by Cohen, Mannion, and Morrison. It's in the Routledge series, and it's a superb book. I strongly recommend it. And if you go to the Routledge website and you type this in, it has a number of PowerPoints on the issue of the case study, which might be really useful as a supplementary resource to this video podcast. Now, beginning now looking at the differences between qualitative and quantitative research. Now, this is very important you understand this because you have different epistemologies or different philosophies of what is knowledge and what's truth, okay? And so if we're looking at qualitative research, the idea is that you look at observations and interpretations. It's usually much more unstructured and freeform, which is why you would look at methods like interviews, for instance, or surveys, or observations of people. So it tends to embrace the idea of subjectivity, and it tends to look at the idea of truth and knowledge as being subjective, and therefore as a researcher, when you're using qualitative methods, you're not trying to get objective ideas so much as getting an idea of the meanings that people attach to their actions and to their practices. Okay, and qualitative research is usually much more small scale, and it's studying people in their natural settings. So if you were to do a qualitative study of, say, the EPQ in our school, we would watch EPQ lessons, we would interview EPQ students, we would get into their minds, we would develop empathy and an understanding of how they see the world. Now, quantitative research is very different. It tends to be about measurable and testable things. So it's working within what we'd call a positivist paradigm, a paradigm that would be more in tune with science and maths, where you get objective things and where you work out statistical patterns and where you have a very structured idea of research and where the idea of the researcher is that they mustn't be involved. There should be no emotions within the research. Okay, so think of how different that is to research where we're on the left here, we're looking at the qualitative ideas and that the research is subjective, where the researcher acknowledges that they have bias, okay? The idea in quantitative research is usually that you don't have bias, yeah? Now, moving on then, as well, the final point about quantitative research is it tends to be large scale, and it tends to look for the idea of generalizability. Now, when we go across to qualitative research, it's often what we'd call particularistic. It would say, this is how things work in this context, and this context is more unique. When you're working within the quantitative paradigm, you tend to say, well, this is how this particular setting works, And let's generalize outwards and we'll find general rules and patterns. So it's much more around the idea of inductive logic. Okay, so I hope that gives you a few ideas then about the differences between qualitative and quantitative research. Now, the great thing about the case study method is that it can actually use many different sources of information. I'm going to be touching on those, okay? So, for instance, within a case study, you can use one-on-one interviews, you can use the focus group, you could use ethnographic research, I'll tell you a bit more about that, you can use observation, you certainly will be keeping records, you might be looking at documents, you could use a whole variety of methods in order to cover the case study methodology, okay? And all of these are within the paradigm of qualitative research, okay? So let's begin with the most obvious question, which is, what is a case study? Well, Robson's definition here is the best one that I've come across, and it's the idea that a case study is a strategy for doing research that involves empirical investigation. So you go and you look at things and you explore them. It's within a particular context, okay, and it's a particular phenomenon within real life, and that's a key idea, okay? So you're going to see things happen as they happen. You're going to see the meanings that people attach. You're going to watch how they operate within a real life situation. This is so different from the positivist quantitative idea where you try to put things in a laboratory and you try to make them context free. Another very important idea of the case study is that it is a bounded system. And by bounded, we mean that you're able to define it. A bounded system is the idea that you're able to clearly define it and delineate it, that you're able to identify something. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in the slides that follow. So when do you use the case study research method? Okay, well, the case study research method is often used when you have a descriptive question. You know, your research question is, what happened? So you want to find out what exactly happened. That's usually using the case study is very good for that. Or if you have an explanatory question, research question like, how and why did something happen? Okay. Now, why would you in the EPQ, for instance, want to use a case study method? Well, I'm going to use an example of a fantastic case study EPQ that was done 2 years ago here in DESC, in Dubai English Speaking College. And the first thing I'm going to say about the case study is it allows you to narrow the report. It allows you to go deep into an issue. So we had one particular student who was very interested in the idea of third culture kids. That's the idea of kids like many of you who've grown up outside of their host culture. So in our case, we've grown up in an Arabic-speaking Middle Eastern culture. The majority of students at DESC are from an Anglo culture. And so we've had to get used to operating within different cultures. She was very interested in this because a lot of psychologists in the 1990s, etc., felt that third culture kids suffered from a kind of cultural deficit. They didn't know where they came from, and there was a lot of negative stuff about it, and she didn't really feel that that was the case from speaking to students. So what she did was she did a study of all of the literature about third culture kids, and then she used DESC as her case study, and she interviewed 50 students, and she got the results of how they felt about their identity, etc. And she felt as though she was then able to use DESC as a case study to counter some of the literature about third culture kids and that being a negative experience. So, the good thing about the case study method then is it works very well with your literature review, okay? It allows you to have, as I say here, a specific case in a wider field of research. So when you do a review of literature, you're reading all about your particular topic, okay? My topic that I research at the moment is project-based learning. So I would read all about the general project-based learning across the world, and then in my literature review, I would narrow, and I could do my case study on, again, DESC and how we do the EPQ in DESC and how that affects student learning and teacher and student relationships. So the good thing about the case study is it can work very well with your literature review. And I've done a separate video podcast on what a literature review is if you want to have a look at that sometime, okay? Now, a case study can be single or it can be multiple. So if I was doing an educational case study, I might just choose desk, okay? As you can see from this. Or if I wanted to do a multiple one, I might feel as though I'm going to use 3 different schools. I've got here Harrow, Beijing, Gardner International School, where I first started teaching internationally in Kuala Lumpur. And I could do a case study in all 3 of these schools, and then I could compare the data between them. Now in the EPQ, this would be a lot more complicated. This is probably something that you would have to leave to graduate and postgraduate level. In the EPQ, I tend to think most of the time we're going to be looking at a single case study, but it is conceivable that some of you might want to do a study into something in Dubai, and then if you have the opportunity of going to England or Australia or your home country, you could also do a similar study there and see if comparing the data was interesting or not, okay? So what are the key features of a case study? So as I've said before, it is the idea of real people in real situations, okay? It's usually a detailed examination of a small sample, and it's an instance of something working while it's in action. It's also an evolving situation, so it's changing. That's the thing, it's in process. So you might want to say that in your case study, that you've seen changes over the course of your study, okay? It shows things, what it is like to be in a particular situation, okay? And they often use direct observations, participant and non-participant observations, as well as interviews, okay? As well, and also in this case, you could be using sampling too. So what are the elements of a case study? It's an in-depth study of one or more settings. It focuses on interactions, relationships, and processes. It has, as I've said before, this concern with the particular, and there are multiple methods of data collection, as I've said before. So you could look at documents, you could do interviews, you can look at work samples. There are many different things that you can use, multiple sources of data, okay? Now, the case study is very intimately linked to the idea of ethnography, okay? And ethnography is an idea that if you want to get an illuminative account of social life and culture, that you actually need to understand how those people see the world. So ethnography is particularly used in subjects like anthropology, where you go and study other cultures, but it's also been used a lot in the social sciences to study things like gangs, organizations, communities, or cults. So it's the idea that you have to actually understand the meanings that these groups attach to their lives and to their actions. That's the ethnographic study idea, that the researcher will see the world through the eyes of the subjects that they are studying. Now, what is a case? Well, a case could be a person, a case could be a group, an organization, an event, or it can even be a practice. So now I'm going to give a few examples. I'm going to start with an absolutely amazingly interesting case study that goes all the way back to the 1930s. And it is called the Jack Roller case study, one of the first ones by Clifford R. Shaw. And it's about a boy called Stanley. So his case is a person. And Stanley wrote a lot about his own life of crime. He got involved in crime at a very early age. He had a very distressing childhood with a broken home and all kinds of violence and stuff. And what Shaw wanted to find out about was how he slipped into crime as a young man, and in particular his life as a jack roller. Now, a jack roller is somebody who robs drunk and defenseless people of their wallets. So at the time, as you can imagine, many people just thought of them as absolute scumbags and not worth learning about, etc. But what Clifford Shaw wanted to do was to see the world through the eyes of the jack roller, in this case, Stanley. So he studied Stanley's life, he interviewed him multiple times, he went to the reform schools where Stanley was imprisoned as a young man, and he also interviewed other people and police officers, etc. So, as I say here, he used multiple sources of data. Now, this is one of the interesting things about this case study. Often to increase validity of the case study, to make it more valid, it's a good thing to use multiple sources of data. And in the particular study that we're looking at here, the Jack Roller, Shaw checked the account that Stanley gave by looking at the laws. He looked at crime data. He did interviews with the police and reform school officers. And this was to triangulate the data and to make sure that what he learned from Stanley was actually accurate and that it triangulated. So this idea of triangulation is a very important one within qualitative research. It's about adding validity to your research, okay? So the question then in a case study is, how far can the researcher be objective? Should the researcher be objective? Well, I'm going to concentrate a little bit again now on the Jack Roller study by Shaw. Now, Shaw admitted when he did this case study that he actually helped Stanley a great deal. He introduced him to a family who helped him. He helped him get a job, and he encouraged him to attend night classes. And by the end of the book, Stanley is completely reformed. The reality is a much more complicated story because Stanley goes back to crime later. But I think it's fair to say that Shaw played a huge part in Stanley's life. So the sympathetic account that Shaw gives, is called into question because he wasn't really an objective observer. And then you, as a researcher doing your case study, have to decide how involved you become in this particular case. And this is why quantitative positivist people often don't like the case study method, because they say, and rightly so, that it is impossible to be objective in this particular form of research. However, that may not be a problem for you if you believe that all research is biased by its very nature. Now, you can have sets of case studies, and I'm going to use a similar example to the one I used before. You could be looking at the roles of teachers, and then you could look at the roles of teachers in 3 different schools. So say we looked at Desk, Sunmark, and our own Indian high school here in Dubai. That would be sets of case studies, not like Stanley, which was one person case study. This would be about sets of case studies together. You could also look at community studies. There's an incredibly famous study here. One of the early case studies in the UK was set after the war in the East End of London. And it basically was a study of family and kinship in post-war East London. So it looked at a whole community, and I've got a few photos here from just after the war. So it would be everything from, say, childcare, female friendships, to the way that men related to each other, to how the community operated and understood itself. Another form of case study that you can do is to look at social groups. This is a fascinating study. It's called Hiding in the Light, by a very famous cultural theorist and sociologist called Dick Hebdige. And he wrote this book based on his study of punks in the mid to late 1980s in the UK. So in this particular case, he lived with punks. He interviewed them. He got to understand the world from their point of view. So he's very interested in this idea of this subculture. You could also be looking at like a practice or how somebody lives their life. Anne Oakley wrote this famous sociological case study called Housewife, High Value, Low Cost. So she wrote a feminist case study looking at the lives of housewives in the United States and the UK. You could also do a case study on an event, and this photo comes from the Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred between Russia, the United States, and Cuba. It nearly sent the world into the Third World War, a nuclear war. And so you could do a case study in which you isolated this one event and you used it to look at something much larger, like the dynamics of the Cold War, for example. Okay? You could also use the case study method to look at organizations and institutions. This is an incredibly famous case study. It's by a theorist called Nigel Fielding. And what he did is he joined the National Front, which is a right-wing nationalist racist organization in the United Kingdom. And he did this in order to investigate their ideology, how they saw the world, what political changes did they want. Once again, it's a very controversial one because it's very dangerous, because these people are often involved in violence, as you can imagine, and it is a semi-criminal organization. But Nigel Fielding wanted to see how they understood the world. He wanted to see the world from their point of view. So once again, there was an ethnographic dimension to this particular case study. So what are the key questions in case study, okay? Well, first of all, you have to work out what exactly is your case. How are you going to identify and select it, okay? Where will you get evidence from? And as I said, you can use multiple sources, okay? So what is an appropriate selection to include from all of the data? When you do a proper case study, you'll get so much data that you basically will have to kind of understand and decide which sources of data you're going to use, which are the most accurate, and how you could have a fair account. Because even within the case study, you don't want the case study to be completely biased. So say, for instance, in my own case, I'm doing a case study based on the EPQ in DESC. I've not only looked at all of the success stories, I have also tried to interview students who've dropped out of the EPQ or teachers who've had problems with it, so that I can have a fairer, more valid account of how the case study, of how this, in my particular case, how the EPQ works in my case study. Now, continued with key questions of the case study, this idea of triangulation, which I touched on earlier. So how will you check data? And this will affect the validation process of your case study, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this issue of generalization in a moment, because that's very, very important, okay? And then you might think about, how are you going to report your case study? How will you present the evidence? And this is very important, ethical issues. So you need to get the consent of people first before you use their words in interviews, etc. You can't invade their privacy. You need to make sure that they've actually concurred with what you've put in the study, checked it later. So ethical issues are very, very important in the EPQ and in research in general. Now, you've got to consider your role as a researcher. You know, in my case, I'm a teacher. You need to decide, are you a biographer? Are you finding out stuff? Are you an advocate? Which means, are you on the side of somebody? Are you an evaluator, which is the best position in the EPQ to be? That you're using the case study to evaluate the situation, and that you're trying to, you know, have an element of objectivity or at least impartiality. So what are the steps for a case study? First of all, you need to identify the approach, okay? So you need to decide what is your research problem. You're going to then select your case. So in my case, I've selected Dubai English Speaking College. In step one, I selected the fact that my research problem was to look at how project-based learning works within my particular case. My step three is the data collection. So in my case, I'm collecting interviews with students and teachers. I'm looking at EPQs. I'm using EPQ production logs where people have discussed their methods and their experiences. And I'm using data as well from the EPQ presentation evenings. So I've got multiple sources of data there. After you've collected your data, you have to analyze it. So you have to decide, how are you going to use it? And finally, you're going to come out with your interpretation. And this is the step at which you will answer your research question. So what are the strengths of case studies? Okay, well, they can establish cause and effect, why things happen. They're very realistic. They happen in real context, as I said. And they give you a lot of insight into determinants of human behavior. So the why questions, why do people act like they do? Why do people believe things that they do, okay? They're very strong on this idea of reality. So one of the disadvantages of using quantitative methods is that it doesn't tell you how people see the world. It doesn't tell you how people operate in the real world. Case studies do. And so case studies, as a result, you could say they accept complexity, uniqueness, and unpredictability. So positivists may not like that, but we could see this as a real strength of the case study, that it shows you how things work in a particular place. More strengths, okay? They can lead to action. So because you've got so much data about a particular place, you can see what the problems are and you can look for solutions, okay? And they can focus on critical incidents that affect organizations or people. And they can be written in a very accessible style, and people can really understand them. They don't need to be filled with jargon and technical things, etc., because they're looking to see how people operate in a real life context, okay? They can be very predictable in some cases, not always the case. And sometimes they can allow you to generalize. You can say, this is what I found in this school, and I'm going to learn from this data, and maybe we could apply it to other schools. So this idea of generalizations in the case study is very interesting, okay? Some people say that you can generalize from the single instance to a class of instances. So say, for instance, I am doing my study on the EPQ in desk, and the insights I gain, we could take to another school, maybe Dubai College, or we could go further afield and we could use it in a school in Singapore or Thailand. We might argue that you can generalize in that way, okay? From the single features of part of the case study to the whole of the case. So you could say, this has worked very well in the sixth form. Will it work very well in year 7? So in that case, you could be looking to generalize that way. From the features of the single case to classes with the same features. So this case study will look at one of my EPQ classes. Can I use it with all the other EPQ classes? And from the single case to the theoretical extension or theoretical generalization. So in that case, you know, this has worked very well with my EPQ. I'm going to generalize across and say, this is very good educational practice and it will work everywhere. So that's a very big claim for the case study. Now, to have a successful case study, it's very important that the researcher needs to have a number of qualities and a number of methods in their toolkit. So I put down, to be an effective listener and questioner is very important. To be an effective observer, to watch things really carefully. So if you're a good observer, usually you keep a diary, or you might have on your phone, you keep audible messages all of the time for yourself, so that you're constantly watching and thinking and picking up evidence, okay? You need to be able to make informed inferences, understand why people are behaving a certain way. You need to be adaptable to changing ideas. You need to have a good idea of research methods. So if you're using things like surveys or interviews, you need to make sure that you're using them properly and that you're not biasing all of the results, etc. You've got to be able to use data well. You've got to be able to collate it and synthesize it and present it in really interesting ways that are understandable to your readership, okay? You've got to maintain confidences with people, coming back to the ethics. So you've got to behave very well towards people. You've got to inform them, get informed consent on everything. And it really helps to have lots of subject knowledge. And that would come from reading your literature and writing a good literature review, because a case study should always have a literature review element to it. So the 6 key decisions in approaching the planning of a case study is where you actually are, where you wish to go. You need to understand what methodological approach you're going to use. You need to understand your strategy. Who will do what, when, and with whom. So how you're going to do it, etc. Obviously, like everything on any form of research in the EPQ, you need to get organized. And then you need to decide really carefully how you're going to present your findings. So with all research, you have to have a kind of a Gantt chart or a timeline or a strategy of exactly how it's all going to work. So the types of data that you can use in the case study are documents, archival records, interviews, direct observation, participant observation. You can use one that I've left off here, focus group. You can use physical artifacts like things that people have made. And you can use actual data like things like school reports, or you could use documents, etc. There's so many different things that you can use. Now I'm going to deal again, I touched on some of the problems with case studies, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail now. They can be very difficult to organize and to decide exactly what is the case. They are not as defined as, say, experiments in laboratories, and they can sometimes get out of control. And that's why a lot of case study theorists say the case study must be bounded. You must decide exactly what the boundaries are going to be. There are often lots of problems with generalizability. So we might study desks, for example, and there are all sorts of unique things about desk. And then we try and generalize and we try and apply this to even another school in Dubai. And what we find out is that the things that worked in desk don't work elsewhere. So it can be the case that there's very limited generalizability with a case study. There's a real problem with cross-checking. We know that if a scientist does an experiment in a laboratory, another scientist can peer review it. They can come along, they can check the results, they can say, actually, this doesn't work. I used everything that you said. I used the same laboratory equipment, the same chemicals, etc. And now I can tell you that your data is incorrect. But how do you do that with the case study? I heard little Johnny say this, and I write it down and I quote him. Well, that's very unique. And how am I going to make sure that little Johnny's opinion actually happened? And how do I know that that is actually like a general truth? Or is it just one random thing that occurred at the time? How am I going to cross-check that? And often there's a bias, enormous bias. For instance, in my own case study on project-based learning, obviously I'm finding that project-based learning is fantastic. And that's because that's my job. It's what I have a passion for. And I might be biasing all the research as I go through it. Now, I thought I would include here, for those of you who are interested, there's a fascinating little 12-minute documentary here on the jack roller, and that will give you some really good ideas of some of the strengths, but also some of the weaknesses with the case study methodology. I'm also including here a number of YouTube video clips, parts 1, 2, and 3 by a professor from Huddersfield University here, are all on the case study methodology. They go into a lot more detail than I've done in this screencast. So if you want to use this and you want to deepen your understanding of this, I strongly recommend that you look at these. The final clip here is by a student in the United States, and he talks a lot about case study method as a qualitative method. It's quite an interesting video podcast for you to have a look at. Now, many students on the EPQ and later in the field of business studies and economics, they use the case study method because you might look at a particular company. This is a very short, excellent little documentary, only 8 minutes long, on Coca-Cola. So it's one case study. Here's another of almost equal length on Starbucks. Very interesting one because it's a case study of why Starbucks failed in Australia when it's been so successful elsewhere in the world. So as I say, if you're doing a business study EPQ, or if you're going on to study business studies at university, the case study is often used as a method of research so that you can focus on a particular company or a particular practice within a company. So, in conclusion, I know this has been quite a long video podcast, so I'd like to sum up and get to the heart of what it was all about. A case study must be bounded. That is clearly delineated. You need to know exactly what you are going to study. It can be a very powerful way of gaining depth and what researchers call thickness in your report, okay? It's a qualitative method that sees people's views and meanings as key. So how people see the world. So it focuses a lot on empathy or ethnography, as I said earlier. The good thing about the case study is it can use multiple sources of data. However, it does raise, and I've covered some of those questions about objectivity, reliability, and perhaps even validity. And one of the key things when you finish your case study is you have to decide how generalizable it is. Does it just tell you about the one particular case, or can we learn more general insights from it? Thank you so much for listening. I hope that some of you are able to get something out of this and that you're able to experiment with the very interesting methodology of the case study.